mother introduced Dr. Brian Alcott as her therapist boyfriend, just weeks after Dad vanished. I tried to be polite. He smiled too long and sat in Dad's chair like he'd earned it. I faked acceptance. He replaced Dad's coffee mug, a symbol I couldn't ignore. We used to say, at least we have each other. Now Dr. Brian sleeps in my father's bed. Subscribe so you don't miss what's next. Before Dad vanished, we had weekend fishing trips. His country songs were annoying then, comforting now. That old flannel he wore, it smelled like lake water and sweat. Dr. Brian threw it away, calling it clutter. Mom said it was for closure. I clung to that flannel as if it were Dad himself. It was more than fabric. It was proof he existed. Now it's gone, like he never mattered, like he never existed at all, back when Dad taught me how to change a tire. We laughed until the wrench slipped and cut my hand. He wrapped it in his bandana, kissed my forehead, and called me a warrior. That bandana vanished too. Dr. Brian said we needed a clean slate. Mom nodded, glazed eyes fixed on Dr. Brian. I kept quiet, bleeding in new ways. Every trace of Dad was being erased, like his love had been a lie. As Dr. Brian's wellness center grew, Mom grew distant. She praised his healing techniques at every meal. I stopped mentioning Dad. Aunt Sharon stopped calling. Even Emma, once glued to my side, spent hours in his meditation sessions. At school, teachers eyed me like I was troubled. I watched my family dissolve under his calm voice and perfect teeth, and I still didn't know where my father was. Uncle Pete offered to help me dig through Dad's things. The half the boxes were missing, donated, Mom said. Dr. Brian claimed it was part of the grief process. Pete's face hardened. That's not healing, that's erasing. We searched the garage anyway, but found nothing. Emma said I was obsessed. Maybe I was, but someone had to remember who my father really was. At dinner, I asked Mom about Dad's guitar, the one he wrote lullabies with. Dr. Brian answered instead, saying it broke and was thrown out. Mom nodded without looking up. I wanted to scream. Aunt Lisa later whispered, "It's in my attic." She looked over her shoulder. Even helping me was risky. I realized then Dr. Brian wasn't helping. He was controlling. Silently, surgically cutting Dad out of our lives. When I showed a teacher my essay about Dad, she pulled me aside. "Maybe you're projecting trauma," she said gently. "Your stepfather says you're struggling." That night, Dr. Brian offered a session. I refused. He called me hostile. Mom looked ashamed of me. Aunt Sharon avoided eye contact. They were rewriting my story without my permission, and everyone seemed ready to believe his version over mine. Marcus Bell finally answered my texts. "I shouldn't talk," he wrote. "It's not safe." That confirmed it. Dad hadn't just left. He was pushed out. When I confronted Mom, she cried and said I was being cruel to Brian. The walls were closing in. Even evidence couldn't compete with Dr. Brian's smile. I wasn't just fighting for Dad. I was fighting for the truth. At the custody hearing, I sat behind a stack of binders, Dad's work logs, therapy notes, appointment receipts. Aunt Lisa brought the guitar. Uncle Pete testified. Dr. Brian didn't flinch. But when I pulled out the flannel preserved in plastic, Mom gasped. "Why would he keep that?" she whispered. I stood. "Because he never left us. You pushed him out." The room silenced. Even Dr. Brian's jaw tightened for the first time. Detective Reyes entered mid-hearing, holding a signed letter from Marcus. Dr. Brian coached testimony. "We're reopening the missing person case." Gasps rippled. Mom's eyes welled up. Dr. Brian stayed still. "This is harassment," he snapped, but his voice cracked. Emma reached for my hand. "You were right," she whispered. That was the moment power shifted, not because of documents but because the silence finally broke. Truth had found a voice. Dr. Brian requested a recess outside. Reporters waited. Aunt Sharon turned to me, tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry." I knew deep down. Mom sat on the curb, dazed. Emma wouldn't stop crying. I wrapped her in Dad's bandana. It still smelled faintly of him. Uncle Pete handed me the guitar. "Play something." My fingers trembled, but I strummed anyway. The sound cut through the courthouse noise like memory refusing to die. When court resumed, Dr. Brian's lawyer withdrew. "Conflict of interest," he said. Brian stood alone. Detective Reyes presented more evidence: altered files, manipulated therapy logs. Mom buried her face in her hands. Aunt Lisa sat beside me, holding the flannel. Judge Holloway said, "This court acknowledges a pattern of psychological coercion." It wasn't a full victory yet, but the tide was turning. Dad's ghost was no longer just mine to carry. Dr. Brian snapped. "You think you know grief? I rebuilt this family." He pointed at me. "She's unstable." I stood, guitar in hand. "You erased my father." "But I remember." The judge ordered security to escort him out. His calm mask shattered. The courtroom watched in stunned silence. Aunt Sharon whispered, "It's over." But I knew it wasn't. The emotional wreckage was ours to rebuild. Truth hurts, but lies destroy everything. The court ruled in Mom's favor, citing lack of physical evidence. I felt gutted. Aunt Lisa squeezed my hand. "This isn't the end." Emma clung to the guitar. Dr. Brian smirked as he exited. But outside, cameras caught his outburst. Detective Reyes leaned in. "We're not done." The flannel, the bandana, the guitar, each piece told a story. They just needed someone willing to listen, and I wasn't giving up. A week after court, I received an anonymous envelope. Inside a USB drive with video files. Dad in a session with Dr. Brian, crying, begging to stay in his daughter's life. "You're a danger." Brian said coldly, "Erase the past." The footage wasn't legal evidence, but it was truth. Aunt Lisa gasped. "Who sent this?" I stared at the handwriting. It matched Cheryl Thompson's letters. Dad's secret confidant hadn't vanished. She was watching. Maybe she still is. I tracked Cheryl down through Dad's meeting list. She answered the door with wary eyes, clutching a suitcase. He followed me. That's why I ran. She gave me Dad's journal entries dated right before he disappeared. He was planning to expose Brian's falsified patient records. My throat tightened. Cheryl nodded. "He was scared for you." That journal wasn't just paper. It was a blueprint and a goodbye letter wrapped in fear and fatherly love. Detective Reyes examined the journal and the chain of custody is shaky, she warned. But this opens the door. We traced timestamps to Brian's clinic records. Several clients vanished after treatment. Marcus confirmed Brian encouraged clients to cut ties completely, even stage deaths. "It's cultish," Reyes whispered. "The state launched a review." Aunt Lisa said, "You didn't just save Dad's memory. You may have saved others. I felt the weight of every erased person pressing forward. News broke therapist accused of psychological harassment. Dr. Brian's photo splashed across headlines. Mom collapsed sobbing. Emma locked herself in her room. Aunt Sharon spoke publicly, denouncing the wellness center. Reporters circled our home. Strangers emailed thanks, sharing similar horrors. Dad's name trended online for the first time, not as a mystery but as a victim. That night, I slept with the flannel under my pillow. He was still gone. But now people saw him. Mom finally faced me. He said your father abandoned us. I believed him. I didn't yell. I showed her the journal. He tried to protect us. Tears streamed down her face. I let him replace everything. We sat on the floor, guitar resting between us. Do you forgive me? She asked. Not yet, I said. Honest, healing isn't fast. But that moment, truth cracked open our silence. And for once, we both stayed present. I found Emma outside, staring at Dad's fishing rod propped against the porch. He used to teach me knots. She whispered. I forgot until now. I handed her the tackle box Aunt Lisa recovered. Inside old Hook's notes, and a Polaroid of us three at the lake. Emma clutched it. I miss him. Me too, I said. We cast a line into the dark water. No fish, just memory, and the line between loss and love. Marcus met me behind the diner, hands shaking. I kept one of Brian's contracts, he whispered, sliding over a crumpled folder. It outlined financial incentives for patient referrals and silence clauses. Your dad threatened to go public. That's why he vanished. My chest tightened. The truth was uglier than I imagined. Marcus added, he knew the risks. He did it for you. I took the folder. Dad didn't just disappear. He was silenced for trying to protect me. Aunt Lisa and I organized a vigil for the erased. We held it at the lake Dad loved. People brought photos, artifacts, things their families lost to Dr. Brian's doctrine. Cheryl spoke about escaping. Marcus read Dad's journal aloud. Mom stood beside me, silent, holding the flannel. When we lit candles, I whispered, he still matters. The crowd echoed it. That night, we didn't mourn just my father. We mourned the invisible scars left behind. Detective Reyes filed an emergency injunction against Dr. Brian's wellness center. Authorities seized files, tapes, computers. Victims' families gathered outside, some crying, others cheering. I watched from the car with Emma. He can't hurt anyone else now, she said softly. Inside, I spotted Dad's patient file flagged dangerous influence. I took a picture before they bagged it. He was never dangerous, I whispered. He was awake. Dr. Brian built a cult. We just called it therapy. Dr. Brian was arrested at a retreat in Sedona. Surveillance caught him shredding documents. His mugshot went viral. Aunt Sharon emailed me. I closed the account. No more money from him. Reporters asked for interviews. I declined them all. This wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. I sent Dad's journal to every family involved. Your loved one mattered, I wrote. We weren't just survivors. We were archivists of stolen lives, and we weren't afraid anymore. Mom started real therapy, this time without manipulation. She asked me to join one session. I want to learn how to be your mother again, she said. I brought the guitar. We didn't talk much that day, just strummed together. The therapist smiled. Sometimes healing starts with silence. Later, Mom gave me back the coffee mug. I kept it, she said. I couldn't throw it away. That mug returned to the shelf cracked, but still standing. Emma gave a presentation at school titled Memory Theft. She used our family as a case study with my permission. This is what happens when healing turns into control, she said. Her classmates clapped. I sat in the back, tears streaming. After class, she hugged me. You saved Dad's story, now I'm telling mine. Her voice was steady. The legacy of silence ended there in that classroom, where truth didn't need permission to be heard. I visited Lake Harrison alone, carrying Dad's journal and the old tackle box. I reread his final entry, you're stronger than me. Never forget who you are. I cast a line and let the wind carry the silence. When the sun dipped below the waterline, I tied the bandana around my wrist. I didn't forget, I said aloud. That lake once held my sorrow. Now it held my promise. I wouldn't be erased either. Uncle Pete started a foundation in Dad's name, Voices Remembered. They hosted support groups for families affected by coercive therapy. I spoke at the first meeting. Healing isn't forgetting, I told them. It's remembering loud enough that silence can't swallow us again. The audience nodded. One woman clutched a necklace, another held a faded photo. We weren't alone anymore. Grief connected us, but so did defiance. We wouldn't let anyone rewrite our lives again. A podcast aired our story, Dad's journal excerpts, interviews, and Emma's school speech. Download soared. Strangers messaged. I thought I was crazy until I heard this. I replied to everyone. Dad used to say, tell the truth, even if your voice shakes. Mine did. Often, but it didn't stop me. Not anymore. The podcast closed with my voice saying, he mattered. It wasn't just about Dad now. It was about every erased voice echoing back. Dr. Brian was convicted of malpractice, fraud, and coercion. The verdict made national headlines. As the judge read the sentence, I stood in the gallery, with Dad's mug in hand. No tears, just breath. Emma squeezed my arm. Mom wept quietly beside us. The courtroom didn't clap, but outside, dozens stood holding candles. Aunt Lisa whispered, he's free now. Not just Dad, but all of us. We were never broken, only buried. And now, we were found. After the trial, I stood alone in Dad's workshop. Dusty tools lined the shelves. I placed the flannel on his workbench, smoothing each fold. We did it, I whispered. The bandana wrapped my wrist like armor. Emma's photo rested nearby. Dad's scent lingered, wood shavings and salt. I didn't cry, I breathed for once. The silence didn't choke me, it held me. He was gone. But he was never erased, not from me. Aunt Lisa framed the guitar and hung it in her hallway. Below it, a plaque read, let memory sing louder than silence. Mom started volunteering at a shelter for trauma survivors. Emma created a website connecting families affected by coercive therapy. We didn't speak about Dr. Brian anymore. We didn't need to, our actions spoke instead. The silence he created was broken. We filled it with music, light, and voices that refused to fade. Dr. Brian was sentenced to 12 years in prison. He stared blankly as families read impact statements. Cheryl spoke first, then Marcus, then me. You tried to erase him, I said, but we remembered louder. Outside, a crowd applauded. Aunt Sharon announced the wellness center would be repurposed as a resource hub. The space once used for control now welcomed truth. Dad's guitar sat on the entry wall, visible proof that silence had lost. 1 year later, we held a memorial at Lake Harrison, not for a body Dad's was never found but for a presence. We scattered paper boats across the water, each with a name, a memory, a voice once silenced. Emma played a chord on the guitar I read from his journal. You're stronger than me, Aunt Lisa added. You're not alone. The sun set golden. We didn't cry, we remembered. That's how we keep the erased alive. Thanks for watching. Hit subscribe to check out more stories on my channel.